Just out of curiosity, how many of you already are not using gluten or wheat? Could I just see a show of hands? All right, so at least I'm not preaching to the choir then. I was kind of imagining that everybody here would already be gluten-free or something. So anyway, let's walk through here a little bit. I'm going to just actually do this as a fairly straightforward presentation, but I've set it up so that there's time for questions afterwards. So as questions come to your mind, be sure and just jot them down. I always tell everybody the only dumb question is the one you didn't ask. So be sure and write them down and save them up. So here we go. Well, we have to kind of think about a long time ago. And so a long time ago, many thousands of years ago, long before we were growing anything, people lived primarily in caves and by the seacoast and all that sort of thing. So we kind of call this our ancient biology. My research interest is actually the genetics and of obesity. And so I deal a lot with how our biology kind of came to be. So at first we had all these dear people that were what we call the hunter-gatherers. And that's kind of where this paleo diet kind of thing came from. It's kind of like, should we go all the way back to how our biology originally originated? So if you happen to be living inland, most of your food would have been meats and roots and berries and seeds, just things that you can gather. And if you happen to be on the ocean side, then you would have fish and sea vegetables, that kind of thing. If you were kind of lucky, you might actually have a little bit of both if you could also go inland. If you lived out in the jungle in the paleo days, you had meats and fish and fruits and probably some root crops that were in there. Now, believe me, nobody had much spare time during those days, and because just getting enough food was the main deal. So unfortunately, nobody was writing in those days. There's really no Bible that tells us about this kind of history, but we depend primarily on the archaeologists and the paleontologists, the people actually looking at skeletons and markings on caves and that sort of thing. So a lot of what we know about that paleo period of time is from that side of life. So if any of you are interested in paleo, I'd really encourage you to read Jean Auel's The Cave Bear Clan series, because she took the best of science and she actually put human flesh to it. So a wonderful series. She was a school teacher at 40 years of age. She started writing these novels, and now she's in her 70s and still teaches up in Portland, Oregon. So I've followed her novels, and there was a wonderful interview on NPR where a young late 20-year-old professor in paleosociologist at the University of South Carolina actually met Jean Auel in person and said when she was a little girl at 8 years of age, she read Jean Auel's first book, and it actually gave her her whole career as a paleosociologist. Really encourage you to look at her novels, pretty wonderful. So then we kind of come into this next era of life, and the Fertile Crescent, and I'll speak specifically to what countries this was going on, but in the Fertile Crescent, this place geographically uniquely had grass that had fairly large grain heads. So a lot of times, grasses, you've seen the grass that grows, and if you don't mow it, you can kind of see how it comes to a head. Well, there's not a lot to eat there. But in the Fertile Crescent, there were grasses that had pretty large heads and could actually be harvested. Not only that, there were wild animals there that actually could be domesticated. So here in North America and South America, we really didn't have any animals that, it's a little hard to ride a buffalo or something, So, but in the Fertile Crescent, there were animals that could be domesticated. Fertile soil, absence of glacier, so that's kind of good news. Temperate climates, and this is where we think the agricultural revolution kind of got started. So now people can actually store calories because you can take grains and you can keep them for a long, long time. So it's kind of cool. You don't have to every day go out and shoot something or gather something, And so you think, well, this is quite remarkable now. And so you do now have time so that you can actually study the stars. And this is when people learned how to write. And so this is where religions arrived. And so now we have Bible stories, and things can be written and things can be preserved. As you read about the different nations around the world, it's really wonderful because everybody thought they were the first. So no matter where they came along, those of you that have looked at Navajo Indian history, they're totally dedicated to the idea they were the first. And if you look into Australia, the Aborigines there, they know they were the first. So everybody was the first, but the people that could write down the stories, they got they got the stories first. So they were the ones that kind of, their stories survived. So this is what we call the big agricultural bang. And we think that this kind of started about 10,000 years ago in southeastern Turkey. So there was a little wheat there that was called einkorn. So it was a grass that had a fairly decent head. And so people could go around and gather the grasses, but you've got some time to think and plan here a little bit, and then they begin to notice that why not put grasses in this patch that's right next to where I live? You see, I don't have to go way over here and collect grasses. I can cultivate. So this whole idea of cultivation started to develop about 10,000 years ago in southeastern Turkey. Now, I had, on all the reading I had done previous to this lecture, I had the understanding that corn actually came from the Fertile Crescent and was brought by the Spaniards into the Americas. But actually, there's now evidence that at about 9,000 years ago in central or southwestern Mexico, there was a corn like a maize that then became cultivated also. So now we've got some contemporary things going, not just in the Fertile Crescents, but also in other parts of the world. And about 9,000 years ago, rice, again, a grass with a small head, was actually domesticated in the Yangtze River area in China. Anyway, there's some kind of cool information about that Chinese situation. So then 8,000 years ago, the wheat farming started to spread into the Balkans and finally made it to Italy. Thank goodness. What would we do without pasta? and so finally they got the idea. 7,000 years ago, in India, they were actually growing wheat also. So you begin to see, partly because of the spread of the agricultural idea, but also the receding glaciers that actually allowed cultivation to actually happen. 5,000 years ago, this was up in Scandinavia, and there was enough ice-free land there that they could actually grow grains. So that's why today we have, in the paleo cluster of diets, we have eat like a Viking. So anyway, so it finally got there. So this agricultural big bang, so you see we went from this paleo thing down to this agricultural thing, and that's kind of where peoples began to consume a lot more of the grains. So this was a kind of a cool thing. You could gather it, you could store it for long periods of time. You didn't have to go out every day. I mean, it's, you know, we're all kind of, even the ancient people, I'm sure they were kind of efficient, or we could say lazy. You know, if you can just go to your corn crib and get some corn, and rather going out and shooting a deer or something, it really kind of makes sense. So the pros and cons in these agricultural time, the pros were that calories could be stored, and people therefore could actually form cities, because when you were hunter-gatherers, just a certain number of people, just a clan, not even a village, but a clan of people, 20, 30, maybe 50 people max, could kind of work together, but they had to be separate from each other, because how many places can you find berries, and how many places can you find some animal to shoot? So the pro here was that now with storing things, people began to live in more like in villages and then cities. Well, that's kind of good, because there was some interaction there that was positive. The con is that people could live in cities, and communicable diseases killed millions. So when you had these people kind of living in small groups, not a whole bunch of people died. But when you started bringing them together in cities, now anything that anybody gets, everybody else gets it. And, you know, the latrines and the communicable diseases. So this was a very big con as well. Now the pros, carbohydrates, calories could be stored. So that was kind of a cool deal. But then the con of that was it's just easier to eat carbohydrates and less protein. So during that period of time, people actually shrunk 2 to 3 inches during this big agricultural push. And I remember visiting Peru and looking at the steps that the Incas were probably 7, 8 feet tall. And their steps are very, very big. And so now you look at Incas and they're all kind of a little small people. So as they started consuming just the carbohydrates, because it was very easy to get to, they actually shrunk. And actually, as we're looking at the skeletons, tooth decay became a very major feature of this whole era of time. So grains became quite famous, in fact. And so the Roman cities, they were famous for something called pulse. Now, this was pretty good. This was a lentils, a legume, and a grain, so they'd be known for their beers and their spirits and their lentils and grains, the pulse. But by combining the legume with the grain, they got more protein. So now we started to see, as they put in more protein, the people started to regain their height. So when they gave up, you know, just eating lots of protein, lots of flesh, then they got smaller. But then as they started to diversify their agriculture, then again, they actually, the height began to come up. So the ruling classes, they could afford for protein in their diet, and the general populations, the slaves, the servants, the tenants, and so on, they couldn't afford much more than just, you know, beer and gruel and grains. So that's where the health kind of was a problem. So these grains were quite small, quite coarse. You had to work pretty hard to digest these. And it turns out in some of our very, very ancient people, there's evidence that at one point, a lot of our pre-human type people actually ate grass. So their molars, they were grinding type molars. So a long time ago, our forebears did have that possibility. So we have this agricultural revolution, which is kind of a cool thing. And all of a sudden now we put upon it another revolution, and this is the Industrial Revolution. Now this is where problems really start occurring. So now we have agriculture on an industrial scale. And, we have 10,000 years of selective breeding. So you find that some of the grasses have a little bigger heads. And so, well, why not just take those and next year plant the bigger heads ones? So just by selective breeding, by selective choosing, actually begin to make larger heads. And this obviously had an economy. And shorter stalks, because what are you going to do with the straw? Might as well, get lots of head and not very much stalk. So then, obviously, all the cooks and bakers and everybody, they kind of noticed that some of the grains had the capacity to be more usable in bakery goods and in pasta. So at that time, they didn't know what did it, but those heads that now we know had more gluten, the bread was softer. And have you ever traveled in Europe, or eaten some of the bakery bread there? Some of those breads could probably be lethal weapons, I mean, and, but everybody likes things nice and soft and dainty and so on. So that the higher gluten became a preference. So, and sadly, this is where the meats and dairy and poultry and eggs was now grain-fed rather than being fed out, just in the pasture someplace. So this was the industrial style of foods. So our eggs, the omega-3s and the omega-6s, the ratios began to change, where these weren't grass-fed beef. This wasn't grass-fed chickens. I used to raise my chickens when my kids were little, and boy, we noticed that when they were just out, eating grasshoppers and weed seeds, those yolks just got orange, and but where if you just fed them, the usual laying mash type thing, well, in the laying mash, they would, they'd produce an egg every day. When they didn't have the laying mash, it was every other day. And so then you look at the label, and 15% of the laying mash is meat scraps. So you begin to, so I made my chickens vegetarian with soy grits or whatever, gave the rest to my kids. So anyway, so now we've got a major problem, and this is just 300 short years. So you think about this incredible span of human history, just kind of forever. And now in 300 short years, our foods have been totally industrialized. Everything is just there. And so now we have industrial food, and there's a little more protein, and people got taller, but they also started getting a little wider. And we've all kind of noticed this. I remember back in where I used to live in the harvest, we would actually chew the grain that was coming out of the combine because it was like candy. It was sweet. So if you just chew just wheat kernels, it's kind of sweet. And so we, as human beings, we're attracted to sweet because a long time ago, there wasn't much sweet out there. And so it was important for us to be attracted to berries, and there was a little honey once in a while. That was kind of good because we were attracted to something that was quite rare, because protein was, you just killed something and you had protein. But sweet was something you would seek after because of the nutrients that would be present there as well. So then flour from grains, we could make things even sweeter by adding sugar. And so then we found that some people actually get addicted to sugar, and we wanted to know, what is this anyway? Why are some people more addicted to grains and sweet things than others? Could I just see a show of hands? How many of you kind of know that you're clearly addicted to sweet things? Yeah. How many of you are clearly not addicted to sweet things? Yeah. Do you prefer more savory things? Yeah. But probably was kind of about 2/3, 1/3, and that's typically how that works, because I ask this question commonly. So one thought about, and among many, so there's a lot of theories why this is. I gave you the one that just says that this is kind of the way it worked. I mean, this is how through thousands and thousands of years, it's just looking for sweet things was a good thing. But here's another idea, and it's during the travels of humans, from the paleo people to the industrial people, we all got cleaner. And in that cleaner, our bugs actually began to change inside of us. So it's pretty amazing now, and there's another lecture going on right now with Dr. Bull, who's talking about the bug story here a little bit. But inside of our body, we have 25,000 genes that are ours, but we have a ratio of 100 to 1 genes because the bugs way outweigh us as far as the numbers are concerned and the genes are concerned. So one of the theories that's kind of emerging is that our sweet tooth may actually be a competition within us. So when you say, I have a sweet tooth, maybe it's your bugs that have the sweet tooth. And so now we're beginning to actually see that there may be competition in our internal biome. So this is all the creatures that live inside of our GI tract. They may be competing with one another, and they may be stimulating the host, that's you, to eat sugar, because it's either good for them or bad for their competitor. So they're actually kind of, it's really not about you. So anyway, this is just something that's recently out, and it was really looking at they had chocolate lovers and then what they called chocolate indifferent people, and they were actually assessing the bacteria inside our GI tract, and it's remarkably different. So who's in control here? You might write this down. I'd love for as many people to participate in this. It does cost $99, but if you're inclined, this is a neat project that the University of Colorado is doing. It's crowdsourcing. And if you just put in humanfoodproject.com/American Gut and pay $99, you'll take just a little brush to some of your stool, and there's about 7,000 people that have already filled out a questionnaire about whether they like chocolate or not. Well, I'm sure it's more than chocolate. And then they're just developing this database. But I think from a research standpoint, pretty exciting. So the 20th century kind of emerges, and this is when the low-fat thing kind of kicked in. And all of us in this room kind of remember how that all came down. And this is when we had a whole lot of cardiovascular disease, and there was I remember this in 1977. I'm old enough as a physician to remember this. I got this great big thick book from the Senate Select Committee, George McGovern, who is not a scientist. He just is head of the agricultural section in the Senate. And this was sent to every physician because we were going to wipe out cardiovascular disease by decreasing fat in the diet. Kind of made a little bit of sense, cholesterol in the plaque and cholesterol in the food, and it kind of made a lot of sense. But this whole thing, including McGovern, was actually dominated by the agricultural industry. And so they very selectively just chose research that supported the hypothesis that eating fat was going to cause you to have heart disease. Did we all notice that during the low-fat craze, did anybody get thinner? No, I don't think so. And the reason why we've had a little dip over on the cardiovascular deaths probably isn't because of low fat, but it's probably because of better medications and better procedures to keep people alive that have atherosclerosis. So during the low-fat craze, everybody got fatter. And it was funny how they would do this. They'd take a food that never even had fat in it, but it would get a label, low fat. So pretty ridiculous. So everyone got fatter on the low-fat diet. So enter this, so kind of contemporaneous to this was this fast food craze. And it just seemed like, again, just like back when we went from paleo to agriculture, it was a whole, if you could store grain, why not just eat grain and don't go out and, dig roots or something? And so now it's true, like, well, why cook if you can just get your food at a fast food place? Today I think architecturally, I don't even know why they put kitchens in houses, it's like, and I know it's kind of going over the edge when I eat more meals in my car than I do at the table, So this thing kind of emerged. So we had busy mothers going to school, profession, raising kids, all this kind of thing. And obviously this stuff was really tasting good because remember we have that predilection to seeking out sweet things. Now, in our bodies, in our brains, we have things that stop us from eating too much fat and too much protein because that was kind of what we had to have back there a long time ago. But we really don't have that feedback for the sweet things because we were supposed to look for as many berries, chew on anything, look for honey if we could find it. That's how we had access to some other nutrients. So that's still there. So add sugar and salt to every food, Today, you can't even find ketchup that doesn't have sugar in it, you see? And it's, and then we begin to discover, this was in the 1950s, that if you gave antibiotics to animals, they got fatter. Remember the biome? So give antibiotics to animals and they get fatter, therefore you can make more money on them. And so the same thing, we started giving antibiotics to the kids if they just look cross-eyed, so antibiotics for everything. And maybe they got fatter too, see? So now we begin to see that something's happening. I want you to look very, very clearly at this slide. This is from 1982 to 2012. And this is kind of this obesity revolution that occurred. So during that period of time, we actually began eating fewer meats, fewer vegetables. Ironically, we actually started using less grain. And we used less dairy products, but look what skyrocketed. Processed foods, sweets, and beverages. Amazing. Look at that. This is actually based on dollars. And so now we have this crazy, crazy agricultural thing that's now gone industrial. Then we put the fast food thing on top of it, and we're just out of control. So now we have food everywhere. I'm told that there are 88,000 processed foods. 88,000 different foods. Oh, I just don't know what to eat. I just don't have any choices. 88,000 processed foods on your shelves. And if you think about your grocery store, I always tell all my patients, always shop around the periphery of the store. That's typically where you'll find real food. Never go into the center of that. And maybe that'll just be if you want to buy some matches or some cleaning powders or something. But the center, 88,000 processed foods, and get this, 82% of those manufactured foods have added sugar. Do we need to say any more? That's where it's happening. So you can begin to see this situation developing, and there's an inflammation that's associated with heart disease, cancer, maybe Alzheimer's, brain fog, arthritis, autoimmune diseases, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome. It goes on and on and on. So all of a sudden, we're now in a place where we start seeing a backlash, and this is where the low-fat backlash starts. Isn't it wonderful how we have to kind of be a little extreme on it, you know? And so, but as we begin to look at this, the paleo diet, the wheat belly, the grain belly, and yes, even the Viking diet. So all of these books and all of these diets are in reaction to this processed food. You know, we're not just talking about some grains. We're talking about highly, highly processed foods. 80% of them having added sugar. A Pringle has sugar. Ketchup has sugar. Things that are even savory still have sugar. And if I had more time, I'll tell you why it's there. And anyway, so in 2011, we had Dr. William Davis. He's a cardiologist, and he went off wheat, but he also went off all processed foods. So think about that for a minute. So yes, he stopped using wheat personally, but he went off all processed foods at the same time. So he reversed his own diabetes. His brain fog, as he describes it, was better. It cured his irritable bowel syndrome. His triglycerides dropped from 350 to 42. His HDL went from 27, that's the good cholesterol, 27 up to 97. His depression cleared. And wouldn't you kind of want to tell somebody about that if that was your experience? So obviously became evangelical about these results. So with that popularization, I want to introduce to you another doctor. So in 2013, wheat belly was in 2011. Now we have grain brain. This is 2013. Dr. Perlmutter is a neurologist. So, and his father has died from Alzheimer's, and he makes some very appropriate connections between elevated blood sugar and inflammation and multiple degenerative diseases and moods. So he pulls upon a very significant amount of science that says that high blood sugar, and remember that processed food, remember 88,000 foods, 80% that have added sugar. So he put the blame on the grain, but in the diet that he proposed, all of those processed foods went away. So we're making a huge, huge change. So you'll love this book. This just came out, Grain Brain Pantry, 2014. And so I got to thinking, well, let's be fair here. Let's just kind of compare some studies here. And so it's true that the ketogenic diet, so these would be diets where you actually go into fat burning. So you're not using a lot of carbohydrates and your calories are low enough that you're actually burning fat. And there is some fairly decent science that says that Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and so on actually does get better. Better watch my time here just a minute. Let me check this. And so with this, he brought that science together. And then a number of people that were actually had celiac. So celiac is a genetic disease that where people have two genes that aren't working well, and they definitely do not do well when they eat gluten foods. So that's why many of you here may have children or grandchildren that have done much better without wheat or gluten in this case. So people get better, re-challenged with gluten, they get worse. They go off of it, they get better. So there's something going on here. So successes in autism, I have a number of patients who their children are autistic and going on this sort of approach. Up until recently, I had a holistic pediatrician that I hired to work in my office, worked with a lot of autistic children and a lot of children with belly symptoms, and made the changes that then allowed them to be much better. So the stool testing is a little bit equivocal, and the direct mechanism may just be a little too simplistic. So as we begin, and this is kind of a complex slide, so I'm going to just describe it to you. So what we're beginning to see is that when we make these changes in some individuals, they're not just giving up grains and wheat, they're giving up processed foods. So that's a big deal. And then we begin to find that food is not the only issue. Many times there's stress factors, there's environmental features that are going on, and this may be even the toxic chemicals that we're exposed to. I mean, you know, every day there's brand new chemicals that the human in our entire history, we've never seen them. We've never had them in our bodies. But every day they're just pouring in, whether it's in the plastic bottles or, you know, pesticides, all this sort of thing. So you begin to see a cascade where diet does form a part of this, but it's multi-triggered with all these other features. So if you want to do without wheat and you want to follow the wheat belly diet, here's what you can eat. So now we're getting down to the tin tacks, aren't we? So you can eat vegetables. So that's pretty cool. Vegetables are filled and packed with nutrition as long as they're organically grown. So I used to, in ignorance, I used to tell patients that, oh, well, if the food grows, it must have everything it needs. And I never stopped to think, well, I noticed that I put nitrogen out on my grass and it all turns green. And isn't that cool? And if you were an agribiz person, wouldn't you like to just put the least amount of money into the development of your product so your profit share would be much larger? They don't put molybdenum, they don't put cadmium, they don't put, they don't put any of these things back into the ground. It's just nitrogen, a little potash, and that's about it, see? The British are very much more concerned about their food than apparently we are, because they track. And today, broccoli that looks like, tastes like, smells like, feels like broccoli did 40 years ago has 40% less calcium than it did 40 years ago. So that's where you got to kind of start thinking about where this food's coming from. But vegetables are wonderful. So you can have greens and peppers and tomatoes and eggplant and squashes. Some fruits, primarily berries. They want you to go a little easy on some of the sweeter ones, like a ripe banana and things like that, pineapple. And you can have unlimited raw nuts, plant-based oils, avocados, olives, coconut butter, all that kind of stuff. Isn't this sweet? Grass-fed, humanely raised meat and eggs. Isn't that nice? I hope somebody just loved that cow just before they slit its neck, So anyway, so grass-fed, humanely raised, I love it. I guess you can kill things humanely. So full-fat cheese, so in other words, the low-fat stuff is kind of disappearing. Ground flax seeds. Now, you can also eat in limited quantities full-fat, unsweetened cottage cheese, yogurt, milk, and butter. Soy, if it's fermented, so only soy that's been fermented. Olives, avocado, pickled vegetables, I was happy to see that. Raw seeds, all that kind of thing. Now here's what you cannot eat. The no list eliminates all wheats, including breads, pastas, cereals, pretzel, donuts, nothing made with wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and certain oats. So it is zero. And you know, there's quite a bit of gluten-free products that are kind of showing up on everyday shelves now, but you can't use any of them because they are made with cornstarch, rice starch, potato starch, tapioca starch. So you can't do that either. So you cut out fructose corn syrup. Well, that's good news. We shouldn't be using that at all. And no fruit juice, no dried fruits, no raisins, no potatoes, no rice, no sodas, and that sort of thing. Trans fats, you don't want those anyway. Fried foods, cured meats, you know, none of that stuff. So I was kind of curious. I wondered, well, what are other people saying about the wheat belly and the grain brain and so on? Andrew Weil, as you know, is at the University of Arizona. He's probably one of our most respected holistic health spokespersons and researchers. And he just kind of says, you know, I can't buy his contention about wheat and proliferation of products and all that sort of thing. And he blames the change in gluten protein in modern wheat from the 1960s. And he said, I see no evidence, no scientific evidence that substantiate these claims. So then he goes on and says that in many respects, Dr. Davis's program just resembles a typical low carbohydrate diet. Again, I can't overemphasize the fact that we all must move away from processed foods. So if you want to use grains and they don't cause you digestion problems or something, for goodness sakes, at least move away from processed foods. Because a lot of the value that's coming in the wheat belly and the grain brain and so on is moving away from those processed foods. So this is from Berkeley. They call it kind of half-truths. Any of you have seen Dr. Davis on Dr. Oz or something? Is a pretty very flamboyant, not phlegmatic, but he calls it Frankengrain, you know, so everything is kind of at a hyperbole. Actually, the fact is that over centuries, food scientists have developed these hybrids and so on, and claim wheat is the main culprit behind obesity. As I showed you, the fact is that actually we're using fewer grains in the midst of actually getting fatter. So that's from the Berkeley Health Letter. So more claims here, and I'll just kind of skip through them. But this is Dr. McDougall. He's a proponent of the vegan diet. And so here's his website if you want to look up some of his information. But Annals of Internal Medicine in 2010, there was the low carbohydrate diet based on animal source was associated with a higher all-case mortality. But you have to remember what he's comparing there. This is actually during the Atkins era where people were eating a lot of cured, crappy meats, you see. So we're kind of comparing, we're not comparing apples with oranges. 2014, greater red meat intake is associated with unfavorable plasma concentration of inflammatory and glucose metabolic markers. 2012 epidemiological studies show that as you put in more animal proteins, you actually get more inflammation. And so I actually found this slide, and I wish I could I guess I could have, but I could hand this to you. This is something a term which you may not be familiar with, but it's called dysbiosis. So that kind of means that the GI tract isn't real comfortable. And this could be everything from irritable bowel to razor blades coming out your rectum or whatever, all kinds of things. Now, the evidence, this is a summary of the evidence, and a red line says that this is protective against dysbiosis, which creates the gut inflammation. You'll notice that the omega-3 fatty acids, the fatty fish, very well established in human studies that it's good and it is a treatment for dysbiosis. there's very good evidence, human evidence. You'll see over there where the apple is, you'll see another red line. So apples and berries and fruits like this have been shown to improve the dysbiosis. Now, where you see the dark black lines, these are things that clearly in humans, not rats, well, rats and humans, clearly cause a problem. So you can see the saturated fats, the sugars, in this case the red meats, and you can see that these, now over here where you see the gray line, and you'll see that over by the loaf of bread, see that little gray line that's coming in, that's where there are some animal studies that would look like this could add to the dysbiosis, but in human studies it's not clear. So that gives you a little bit of a summary of at least where the science is today. So if you want to give it a try, here's what you can do. So this will not be easy. And this is pretty wonderful. So just kind of forget eating out. And the whole family's got to be on board here. Now, a number of families have and are doing this. And they're getting healthier because primarily they are using no processed foods. Did you kind of start hearing a theme coming through here? No processed foods, zero. And so people who would be most likely to give this a try, and I encourage you, if you kind of fit into this, anybody that has kind of a GI tract upset, you know, where you kind of go between diarrhea and constipation, and it's a little gassy, and it's always all kinds of problems there. Many times by getting off processed foods, and in the process of doing that, moving away from the starches and the wheats, this will happen. Diabetics may consider this as an option. Food addicted individuals. So I mean, come on, be real. So if you notice that you've ordered this chili relleno and there's a little bowl of chips that's here, and before the chili relleno comes, 3 bowls of chips have disappeared, let me think about that for a little bit. You know, so just don't do it. It's very, very difficult to use cocaine moderately. So if you're addicted, you're addicted. So many of my overweight patients, they actually mark the first 4 days of every month, and we call them Betty Ford days. And on those 4 days, no corn, no wheat, no rice, no potatoes, and no sugar for 4 days, and they feel like they're withdrawing. They feel headachy, they feel grouchy, they feel terrible. But the rest of the month will be a whole lot easier. But they will probably become re-addicted because remember that 80% of the processed foods have added sugar. We sprinkle cocaine everywhere, and we make money doing it. So if you happen to be one of these people, you might try this. Now get this. Here are your flour substitutes. Almond meal. So you can actually make flour out of almonds. And it's versatile, and I watched the Dr. Oz show where Dr. Davis actually showed how he could make a tortilla and how he could make a muffin and all kinds of sorts of things. But almond and this flour, I guess you can find it somewhere, and you can actually even make cake. Now ground pecans, this is another flour, it's a nut flour. You can make pie crusts out of this. Ground walnuts, so this is a little coarser and so on. And coconut flour, so you can see where the flours are coming from. And the Grain Brain and the Wheat Belly cookbooks will tell you exactly how to do this. Flaxseed often comes up as a flour as well. Pumpkin seeds, chia seeds. And now tortillas. I thought this was cute. So 1 cup of golden flax seed, ground, 4 tablespoons of almond meal and 4 tablespoons of almond flour, 1/4 teaspoon of fine sea salt, 2 eggs. Directions: preheat the oven to 375, a large baking sheet lined with parchment paper. Add flaxseed, almonds, and whisk in eggs just until combined. Divide the dough into 4 equal balls using 2 pieces of parchment paper. Roll each out, and boo-wah, bake for 5 minutes, and now you have a tortilla. I don't think any good upstanding Hispanic would call that a tortilla. Oh, or you want to get that one back? There you go. All righty. Now this next one is a prepared food, so I'm kind of trying to figure out if this is processed or what it is. But you can actually get a spaghetti, and so this is a tofu shirataki. Here's the brand, House Foods, and at least on the show where I saw this demonstrated, there was an Italian mother, and they were hoping that she would say this was wonderful, you know, and she made this face. She goes, ew. But then she said, well, if it had been my sauce, it might have been okay. Anyway, so you can see quite a number. So reasons for confounding of the data, the paleo, the grain, brain, and all this sort of thing. Here's what they have in common. All are processed foods, and the chemicals they contain. Avoid all free sugars. Lower calorie intake, obviously, because there's a whole bunch of foods that you're not eating. And so there does seem to be an association with a healthier people are trying this. So some are all going so far as they're turning down their thermostats. They found that caves, I think it was caves, typically are 62 degrees. So, and they actually are supposed to sleep on rocks, you know. So you could probably take it a little too far. But if you're using animal products, be sure and use them from, you know, grass-fed, you know, truly good quality. So contrast to the studies, the high-fat, all grain-fed, filled with antibiotics and drugs, there's a big, big difference, and I don't think we're comparing apples with apples. Personal experience, a number of my patients in the obesity world do much better without these products. Empiric evidence, if adults and children, you know, you go off the grains and you feel better, do it. I've got a personal story, and that is when I couldn't figure out why I had razor blades coming out my rectum, and I went off wheat, and it went away. So then I went to Italy, and I said, I'm going to eat all the bread I can, all the pasta I can, and there was no problem. So I thought, well, maybe I'm cured. Came back to the United States, used the North American wheat, razor blades out the rectum. So there are going to be some differences, and you're wise to, I mean, it could be, maybe you're sensitive to broccoli would cause razor blades or something, but you got to kind of look around and see what symptoms you have and how that relates. If you're interested in the brain chemistry of obesity, I would invite you to watch this TEDx talk I did. If you just put in 2 words, obesity, and the words clash, like symbols clash, you'll find a little humor there and a little sad story about my own father. So with that, I'm going to kind of open it up for questions because we've kind of run out of time.